show you, in fact, that if a child has a disability, you're still going to be better off teaching them in their native language. And in terms of how that works, I'll explain a little bit here. And in terms of the importance of language, I like this study here by Betty Hart and Tard Risley because it shows that and this study was done with nothing but native English-speaking children. So there was no language difference here. Native English-speaking children. All that they were doing was separating them into high verbal and low verbal families. And they did that primarily on the basis of socioeconomic status, because what they found was individuals who were more highly educated spoke more to their children. Individuals who were not very well educated tended not to speak as much to their children. So they looked at the amount of time they were speaking to their children, and they compared them at the age of 3 and then again at the age of 8 to see if there were any academic or developmental differences. And what they found was that by the age of 3, just 3, children in high verbal families had heard 30 million more words during those 3 years than children in low verbal families. 30 million. Remember how many words I told you there were in English? How much repetition and rehearsal it takes? 30 million words is a huge advantage having heard by the age of 3. In fact, when they followed him up at the age of 8 in 3rd grade, they were able to predict 3rd grade achievement on the basis of number of words heard at the age of 3. So you can predict 3rd grade achievement by how many words a child has heard at age 3. So you see how quickly language is developing, how powerful an influence it is. And it's not so much that there's something unique about it, it's just that it's rooted in time. And as much as you want to change development, you can't. Huge, and it's powerful. And when you look at it in terms of the development of children, there's this idea, and here's where our policies get out of step with science. The policy is, okay, teach the children English, they're young, they'll learn it, and everything will be fine. The presumption is, once you've learned to speak English, aren't you like everybody else? Aren't you comparable? Haven't you caught up? Well, that was the theme that a gentleman was running on this platform in California when I first created this chart. And he was, his name was Ron Unz. He was actually championing anti-bilingual education with a referendum called English for the Children. Who wouldn't vote for English for the children? I would vote for English for the children, okay? But what it really was no native language instruction, teach them in English so they can catch up. Well, I thought, well, let's just do the math and find out when that catching up takes place, because I was confused and I didn't understand how it was supposed to work. So I created a chart that goes from birth to age 14, from kindergarten to 9th grade, and I put numbers here corresponding to thousands of hours of language exposure. And then I divided it up into before school starts, 5-year period, then after 5 years of instruction. And I had to make some assumptions about language, and I hope you will agree with me on them, in order to do this. It's kind of like a thought experiment here. But the assumptions are simply this. Number one, to learn a language, you pretty much have to be conscious. You have to be awake to learn a language. So all we have to do is figure out how many hours is the average child awake, and we can calculate the average number of hours of language exposure a child is getting. Normal circumstances, okay? And to do that, I took a native English speaker and I figured out how many hours is the average child awake between birth and age 5. It's actually fairly simple. If you look it up and you ask pediatricians and so on, it comes to about 12 hours on average between birth and age 5. Newborns, infants tend to sleep a little bit more. By the time they get to be toddlers, they sleep a little bit less, but even toddlers are still taking naps and so on. So it works out to about 12 hours. Anybody have a problem with 12 hours? 12 hours is what they say. I can show you. I have a copy of some reports by a pediatrician if you have any doubts. 12 is reasonable, right? Okay, so if you do the math, 12 times 5 times 365 is 21,900 hours. So the average kid enters kindergarten with 22,000 hours approximately of language exposure. Now, the kid is native English speaker, being raised by native English speaking parents, and gets instruction in English. So let's say kindergarten is full day and the rest of them are full day. So that's 7 hours a day from here to here where the child's instruction will be in English. But we know that children sleep a little bit less during this period, right? They're awake a little bit more. They don't sleep 12 hours anymore. How many hours is reasonable for children to sleep between age 5 to age 10? Remember, the adult recommendation is 8 hours of sleep, which means you have a maximum of 16 hours a day recommended that you should be awake. So we're talking about children. We're not even talking about, young adolescents here. We're talking about grade school children. What should their number be? We know it's more than 12, but less than 16 hours awake. What's a reasonable number? 14, right? Well, kind of in the middle, so it sort of makes sense. And in fact, that is exactly what pediatricians say. They say these guys are about 11, these guys, these guys 13 hours awake and 11 hours of sleep, and these guys 14 and 10. So I just use 14 and 10 across the whole thing to do the math. And if you make the calculations, 14 times 5 times 365, 25,550, add it to 21,900, and you get 47,450 hours. Now, what that means is, by the time a kid gets to 5th grade, there are about 47,000 hours of language experience. That's a lot of experience, right? It's building. And in terms of schooling, what we know about BICS and CALP is that it takes CALP how long to develop? CALP? 5 to 7 years minimum. Some people say 7 to 10 years. Well, if it's 5 to 7 years, then that means that CALP should be developing somewhere around 4th grade, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Does that make sense in terms of the curriculum, in terms of what happens in schools around that time? Kind of does, doesn't it? Because kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade is usually basic skills training. That's where you learn to read, learn to write, learn to do math. Then what happens around 4th grade, we start doing weird things like introducing word problems. And you change the focus of the curriculum from learning to read to reading to learn. And we now start developing conceptually. So CALP begins to emerge, looks like the curriculum follows it around 4th grade. Makes sense, right? Developmentally, everything is perfect. Now, what happens when we have a limited English speaker like me? Born in the United States, I was fairly typical, and as our kids today. Born in the United States, parents come from Puerto Rico, but born in the United States, I'm awake 12 hours a day, just like any other kid, from birth to age 5. But how many of those hours would I have had in English? Now, I have a sister who's just a year older than I am. My parents, like I said, they don't know much English even at this point in time. You know, my dad was in the Marine Corps. All he had to do was say yes or no, sir. It's not like he needed an extensive vocabulary, okay? My mom had been taught to actually read and write in English, but not to speak it, because she was like the Japanese. Her instruction was with English language textbooks taught by people who spoke Spanish. So she didn't have conversational practice. So I'm listening to Spanish pretty much, and we didn't have much TV, so it was kind of limited, no preschool. Of those 12 hours, given that background, how many of those would you say were in English for me? I don't want to say it's 0, because I know it wasn't 0. It had to be some. Now, I do have a Hispanic mother. I'm tied to her hip. I don't get out of the house till I'm 3 anyway, right? Because I might catch some bug or something, I don't know. Some voodoo thing might be happening. But anyway, and I finally get out, maybe go to the commissary with her, come back, whatever. So I get a little bit. How many of those hours do you think would be reasonable? On average, 12 hours a day, how many could be in English for me would be a reasonable amount? 2, 1.5 to 2? Something like that. I mean, one might be okay and perfectly reasonable. 2 getting up there. I sort of did it logically. If I go to 3 hours, that's like 25%, 1/4 of every day, 1/4 of my experience. That's just seemed like too much. So I couldn't go to 3. And I didn't want to make it seem like I was trying to minimize it. So I didn't want to go with 1, even though I thought 1 was probably the more appropriate one. So I went with 2. I wanted to be conservative. I want to catch up, so I went with 2 hours. So let's see how 2 hours works. 2 hours times 5 times 365 gives me 3650. So when I start school, I was about 18,000 hours behind in English, right? Okay, but now I'm going to school and I'm going to get schooling all in English. Even if you give me ESL, ESL's in English. So it doesn't matter. I didn't get ESL, but it doesn't matter. It's all in English. So that's 7 hours a day right off the top are in English. But I'm awake 14 hours a day, which means I'm 7 hours awake that I'm not in school. Waking up in the morning, getting ready, eating breakfast and so on. Coming home after school, doing homework, playing in the afternoon, TV, bedtime, dinner, homework, and those kinds of things. So all those combined, that's 7 hours I'm not in school. How much of those would also have been in English? What do you think? What's a reasonable number? 2 to 3? Yeah, I kind of reasoned it this way. I thought, well, I'm doing homework in English. I'm learning to read in English. Probably watching a little bit more TV now. I've got a sister who may be starting to speak English. Maybe my parents are picking up a few more words. So I thought, I actually thought 3.5 would be fair, but I didn't want to use fractions because I didn't want to traumatize you. So I rounded off, and I rounded off conservatively. I went up. I said 4. So maybe 4 is a bit much, but nobody could argue with saying, well, you're trying to skew the results, not catch up. I want to catch up. So I said 4. 4 out of those 7, which is a majority of those hours, are also in English. So that's 4 plus 7 is 11. And when you do the math with that, you get 11 times 5 times 365 is 20,075. Added to the 3650, you get 2375. And as you can see, by the time I'm in 5th grade, I was 18,000 hours behind at first, but now I'm only 24,000 hours behind. What happened to the gap? It got bigger by like 30%. That's not supposed to happen. I'm supposed to be catching up. Did we do something wrong? Are my assumptions incorrect? No, assumptions are reasonable. I'm standing by those. And my math, you can double check my math, but I think the math is all right too. Didn't make any mistakes there. So, given this situation, when am I going to catch up? When? Never? Now, never is a very strong word, right? We have to be careful, because I actually know of 2 ways I could possibly catch up. All right? How are they? Well, here's the first one. See the red line right there? If that kid were to die, I would catch up. Right? If I'm the only 10-year-old left in the world, at some point I passed up everybody else. But these are not individual kids. This is sort of an aggregation. So I was talking about the population. So they're not all going to die. I'm not going to pin my hopes on that, okay? And the other thing that is I said possible, not probable, but you could do it if you gave me 32 hours a day of English language exposure. I would catch up. 32 is all it takes, 32 hours a day. Right? So until we figure out some kind of Einsteinian time warp, quantum mechanical change in the fabric of space and time, whatever, it's not going to happen. All right? So you're kind of right in saying, yeah, never. It's never going to happen this way. But now somebody might look at this and say, wait. Look at this, Dr. Ortiz. Look, way over there, you're going to get to CALP when you're in about, looks like, I don't know, is that 11th grade, somewhere in there? And you're right. I will get to CALP in English by the time I'm in 11th grade. According to this method, it will happen to me before I leave high school. But what does that mean in terms of its instructional and its evaluation or assessment implications? It means I'm in 11th grade, but I am ready for, and I am performing at, a 4th grade level. I'm at the point where the average native English speaker is getting 4th grade education. I'm performing at a 4th grade level. If you test me now and you get your scores and your numbers, you're going to look at me and you're going to tell everybody at your, do you call them IEP meetings? Is there another one you use? What is it? Case conference? Oh, okay. I ask because states have different names for them, like Texas is ARD, Admissions Review Discharge. New York is Committee on Special Education, CSE. Minnesota is like MDT, multidisciplinary team, so I never know where I am until I know what you call them. So case conference, IEP meeting. So you're there, you're going to tell everybody at that table, guess what? This kid is 7 grade levels below. He's a junior in high school, reads at a 4th grade level. Tell me you're not going to classify me as intellectually disabled and put me in special ed. You will. What choice do you have at that point? You're looking at such a huge difference. Who's going to question it? Who's going to step up and say, you know what, that's just a cultural linguistic difference? 7 grade levels. How could I have been in school for 11 years and I'm 7 grade levels below? But I am. That's the reality. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with me. This is not a disability. This is a dramatic difference, but this is not a disability. And yet it's powerful because it looks so much. How do I catch up? There's really only one way. And it's based on development. If we're going to provide education, you have to recognize that when I started school, I had this much here of English, but I had this much, this whole part here, minus this little part there, right? I had 18, let's see, if you do the subtraction, 18,250 hours of Spanish language development when I started school. I did. Not unlike any other kid. I just had 3,650 in English, but I had 18,250. If you continued my education and my development in my native language, you allowed me to learn English on the side, which is not difficult to do. You could give me ELD if you wanted to. It's not a problem, or ESL. But I would get to CALP in my native language by the time I was in 6th grade, not by the time I was in 11th grade. And the difference, you're thinking, oh, but you're performing at a 4th grade level still, even though you're there, right? No. I only need the language to be at the 4th grade level because my skills are at grade level. I've not been interrupted. I'm exactly where I need to be, but my language is still a little bit behind in English. Just a little bit. All you got to do is make it comprehensible. And what's the difference between the language a child might hear in a 6th grade classroom versus the English language a child might hear in a 4th grade classroom? Is it substantially different? No. It's very easy to bridge that difference. And by the time I am in 8th grade, you won't even have to worry about it because I will be at grade level.